Today is October 13th, 2025. The conflict in Ukraine continues. What is essentially a U.S. proxy war against Russia, because current U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said it was essentially a U.S. proxy war, where the U.S. is backing Ukraine to fight Russia. A war President Donald Trump has accused his predecessor of unnecessarily provoking with Russia, and a war he campaigned for office saying he would end within 24 hours. The conflict not only continues, but it is dangerously escalating. And I want to remind people that even though President Trump does attempt to blame the conflict on President Joe Biden, and it most certainly unfolded during his administration, and with President Biden overseeing every aspect of it and every step of escalation along the way, it was President Donald Trump in his first term who set the stage for this conflict. And I just want to refresh everybody's memory. This was from ABC News. All the way back in 2019, Trump administration approves new sale of anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. President Trump, to this day, still brags about how he was the one who sent weapons to Ukraine first. Not the Obama administration, not the Biden administration, President Donald Trump during his first administration. $39 million of lethal weapons to Ukraine, including the anti-tank Javelin missiles. Now, fast forward to today, again, after campaigning on ending the conflict, it is escalating. It is escalating, even if and I'm going to cover the Tomahawk missiles first. Even if the missiles don't go, I will get into how this is all escalating anyway, nonetheless. So this is from the BBC. This is just earlier today. Trump says he may send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. He is not ruling this out. U.S. President Donald Trump is considering sending Tomahawk Long Range cruise missiles to Ukraine, saying it would provide a new step of aggression in its war with Russia. When asked on Air Force One if he would send Tomahawks to Ukraine, Trump replied, "Well, we'll see, I may." It follows a second phone call at the weekend between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who pushed for stronger military capabilities to launch counterattacks against Russia. Now, what is the purpose of sending these Tomahawk missiles? It is not just a general threat. It is being sent for a very specific reason, to achieve a very specific task, and that is to hit more of Russia's energy production facilities than Ukraine can currently hit with their drones and other missiles that the US and Europe have sent to Ukraine. And I will get into all of that here in just a minute. This is where the conflict is most certainly escalating, regardless of whether the Tomahawks are sent or not. But I want to talk about the details of the Tomahawk cruise missile itself. A lot of people believe that it's not possible to send the Tomahawk cruise missile to Ukraine. It's normally launched from sea, from warships and submarines, and land-launched systems are a nascent capability the U.S. has only begun deploying through the Typhoon system, which is being manufactured and is already deployed within the U.S. Army. They are stationed on the Philippines right now. Missiles pointing at China right now at this moment. The Typhoon system, and let me see if I can show you a picture of what this looks like. These are some of the articles that I will be linking to. You can see how large and cumbersome it is. These are the Mark 41 missile launch canisters. They extend upward like this, and then they are fired in a very similar way that they are fired out of a submarine or from a ship. And you can see how large these are and how cumbersome it is, and it might not be practical to send these systems, which do not exist in large numbers, to Ukraine. This is something Alexander Micuris of the Duran has been pointing out in recent videos. And it is indeed cumbersome. It would be very easy for Russia to trace these missiles back to where they are being launched and strike at not just the launcher itself, but all of the supporting equipment around it. Where I would say that if these were deployed in, say, Odessa, and they were being placed inside hardened shelters or in tunnels underground, and they are brought out and they are fired, It might take Russia a while to trace them back to these facilities and bring sufficient firepower on them to destroy them or to catch them out in the open. And this is what has happened with other Ukrainian systems transferred over to them by the West. This is how Russia has been systematically dealing with them. However, there is another system that is much smaller than these systems here. And as a matter of fact, it's pictured up here. This, the Typhon system, if you can see in the picture, there are 4 Mark 41 cells. And on this long-range fire launcher, there is a single Mark 41 cell. And this was a system that the US Marine Corps, from say around 2020 to 2025, it was proposed, they were developing it, and then these were actually deployed to the US Marine Corps, who was using them experimentally to work out whether they could use this or not and whether to expand their inventory of these systems. And so we have, let's go with this article first from the War Zone. Marines Tomahawk missile launching drone truck breaks cover. And so this was when? This was 2023. Tomahawks fired from mobile ground-based launchers give the Marines a long-range strike capability unlike any they've had before. And this picture can be deceiving. It looks like a little tiny Jeep. And you're saying, how could that be a Tomahawk cruise missile in there? But if you look at this picture, you could see a US Marine closer to the truck in the background. You can see how large that vehicle is and how massive that Mark 41 canister is on that launch system. The US Marine Corps has finally given us a look at the uncrewed 4x4 launch vehicle at the core of its new ground-based Tomahawk cruise missile unit, dubbed the Long Range Fires launcher. It is similar but not identical to the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle-based design that the service is also fielding as a launch platform for Naval Strike Missile anti-ship missiles. And this is the Naval Strike Missile launcher. They refer to it as Nemesis. They have decided to go with that instead of this Tomahawk launch system. And to that end, the Marine Corps canceled. They axed the adoption of the ground-launched Tomahawk cruise missile. Tomahawks launched from uncrewed vehicles were seen as a new way for Marines to hold targets at risk over long distance. And it says, the U.S. Marine Corps' plans to sling Tomahawk cruise missiles from remotely operated 4x4 launcher vehicles have come to an end. The service determined that the complete long-range fires system could not be effectively used in the kind of austere environments that it expects to be a centerpiece of future operations. This might have further implications for the U.S. Army, which has been eyeing the LRF as a possible smaller and more readily deployable companion to its Typhon system and its large tractor-trailer launchers capable of firing Tomahawks and SM-6 multi-purpose missiles. They don't actually explain the reason why they said it was not suitable to austere conditions, but it would probably be because there's only one missile. It launches the missile and then you have to immediately begin reloading it, which is a time-consuming process. You're doing it out in the open, you're vulnerable, and it would just be better if you could launch several missiles at a time and then move and then reload somewhere else. However, if you're deploying this to Ukraine, or if the US Army is using this in conjunction with its much more cumbersome Typhon systems, it could provide advantages. If you were using this in, say, Odessa, again, as a place where the Ukrainians and their Western sponsors like to deploy some of these long-range weapon systems, you would have several of these launchers launch their missiles all at once. And you would do this once a week or every couple of weeks. You'd carry out these large-scale, relatively large-scale, you wouldn't fire just one cruise missile. You'd fire a number of them together with maybe air-launched cruise missiles and a large number of drones and decoys to try to give the Tomahawks the best chance possible, penetrating as much of Russia's integrated air defense system as possible and hopefully hit these targets much deeper inside Russian territory. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like, if this is Ukraine, and let's just use Odessa as a point. And it doesn't necessarily mean that's where they're going to go, but just for example, 2,500 kilometers. That goes way, way past Moscow. It goes past the Urals and Nizhny Tagil, which is home of the legendary Ural-Volgin Zavod tank factory where the T-72 and now T-90s are produced. It's a Russian tank factory. And there's many other things that would be in range if these Tomahawks were deployed. And of course, they're also talking about hitting energy production facilities. So this is the plan. This is how this is all taking shape. These systems were working. The US Marine Corps was using them. They were testing them out, and they were not scrapped because now the US Army is considering them. And there's another article here, Naval News. This is September 2025. US Army resurrects canceled Marine Corps Tomahawk launcher for live fire test in 2026. And this will be a live fire test they plan on doing in the Philippines, side by side where their Typhoon systems are already based and pointed at China. So this is a very real possibility. People saying that the Tomahawk cannot be deployed to Ukraine because there's no appropriate system to do so. This is a system that they have on hand that they could use to deploy and fire at least a handful of Tomahawks all at once at targets deep, deep inside Russia. Could these systems be built in large numbers and flood Ukraine and then thus flood Russia with Tomahawk cruise missile strikes? Probably not. And that, I think this goes back to the military-industrial production crisis the collective West has. They make very small numbers of Tomahawk cruise missiles each year. They have a large number of them on hand, but they need to use these for conflicts the United States is fighting all around the globe. Plus, they are stockpiling them for a potential confrontation with China. And again, the US Army is talking about deploying this in the Philippines specifically to potentially target China itself. So what the United States would be doing is something very similar to what they used the ATACMS for. They are using the ATACMS to raise the cost for Russia, to cause more damage to Russia across a wider spectrum of potential targets. They would also be testing these systems out ahead of possibly using them in a direct conflict or another proxy war with China. And so it's not because the US thinks we'll send the Tomahawk cruise missile to Ukraine and then we will win this war. No, it is the whole purpose of this war was always to tie up Russia, overextend it to the point where the US could succeed in, say, regime change in Syria with Russia preoccupied in Ukraine, tie Russia down, extend Russia, create an extremely costly, protracted conflict, which the US has successfully done, and deploying Tomahawk cruise missiles would help raise that cost for Russia. And again, the idea of already carrying out strikes on Russian energy production and refineries all across the country, they're already carrying out a campaign to target these facilities. The Tomahawk missiles would allow them to strike more of these facilities across a wider range and deeper into Russia. And speaking of that, getting back to that, there was a Financial Times article that's behind a paywall, but other media outlets have covered the contents of the article. The Telegraph, for example, Trump shares US intelligence aid Ukraine strikes on Russian energy sites. The move marks further signal of Washington's growing support for Kiev and hardening stance towards Moscow. Now, I warned people before President Trump even won the election in 2024. He was not going to end the conflict in Ukraine. This was all about division of labor and strategic sequencing, because that's what the neocon warmongers that he was filling up his cabinet with, that's what they had been writing in policy papers years before the 2024 election even took place. And it's an extension of the same continuity of agenda that has been taking place all throughout the 21st century and to a greater extent throughout the Cold War and ever since the end of the Cold War. Now, the Telegraph article says the U.S. has been assisting Ukraine step up its long-range strikes on Russian energy targets in an attempt to weaken Putin's war effort and force him to the negotiation table. For months, Washington has provided Kiev with the intelligence needed for its intensifying aerial offensive against critical Russian refineries, pipelines, and power stations, according to Ukrainian and U.S. officials. The intelligence sharing, the officials told the Financial Times, has been crucial to helping Ukraine carry out the attacks since midsummer that have driven up domestic prices, cut Russian oil refining by a fifth on certain days, very important caveat there, and have seen a reduction in exports from key ports. This means, because this goes all the way back to July, this means when President Trump was pretending to mediate in the middle of America's own proxy war on Russia simply being fought through Ukraine, and he invited Russian President Vladimir Putin to the U.S. state of Alaska for negotiations. At the very same time, he was overseeing a U.S.-led and directed strike campaign at energy production all across Russia. And this is probably why President Putin very politely refused to agree to anything the U.S. was proposing, because it was being done, as I had pointed out at the time, in absolute bad faith. And now we can see just how bad that faith actually was. But this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because as I pointed out since February of this year, just a month or two into President Trump's second term in office, this was U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in Brussels telling Europe what they were going to do to help fight the U.S. proxy war against Russia, to continue it. And he was talking about doubling down on arms production and shipping arms, ammunition, and other forms of support to Ukraine itself, getting European troops to go into Ukraine, essentially to freeze the conflict and rebuild Ukraine's armed forces. But then he says this must not be Minsk 3.0, but that is literally what he is describing. Okay, so he's talking about freezing the conflict and then Europe investing heavily in rearming and rebuilding Ukraine's armed forces, but also sending European troops into Ukraine to ensure that once Russia realizes they were betrayed, they would actually have to fight a war directly against Europe to continue with the special military operation. That was the whole point of all of that. It was very obvious at the time. And then he said this: to further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine. So they're talking about energy prices and the Russian war machine. Just like the Biden administration, this is what the Trump administration was making a connection between. President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions will help bring Russia to the table. So that's what the US was saying in public. But even at the time, there were already Ukrainian drone strikes being carried out against Russian refineries, targeting Russian energy production. And then that campaign was accelerated and expanded. And this is from the BBC. Surge in Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries sparked Russian fuel shortages. This was back earlier this month, October. And what they're doing is connecting the drone strikes to Ukrainian intelligence agencies. They talk about the SBU specifically. And now this is getting to the actual point of all of this. We know, because the US media, the New York Times specifically, has told us that the United States Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, all the way back in 2014, long before Russia launched its special military operation in 2022, all the way back in 2014, the CIA went into Ukraine. They took over Ukraine's intelligence agencies and they restructured them, reorganized them, rebuilt them, trained them, directed them ever since. That is what they have done. That's this article right here. The Spy War, how the CIA secretly helps Ukraine fight Putin. For more than a decade, the United States has nurtured a secret intelligence partnership with Ukraine that is now crucial for both countries in countering Russia. And that continues to today under the Trump administration. Nothing has changed since then. The article talks about how a CIA-supported network of spy bases were constructed in the past 8 years that included 12 secret locations along the Russian border. Imagine if Russia was doing this in Canada after overthrowing the Canadian government. Imagine what the US response would be. Around 2016, again from the New York Times, the CIA began training an elite Ukrainian commando force known as Unit 2245, which captured Russian drones and communication gear so the CIA technicians could reverse engineer them and crack Moscow's encryption system. And one officer in that unit is Bundanov, who is now the head of Ukrainian military intelligence. And the CIA also helped train a new generation of Ukrainian spies who operated inside Russia, across Europe, and in Cuba and other places where the Russians have a large presence. The relationship is so ingrained that CIA officers remained at a remote location in Western Ukraine when the Biden administration evacuated US personnel in the weeks before Russia invaded in February 2022. During the invasion, the officers relayed critical intelligence, including where Russia was planning strikes and which weapon systems they would use. So the CIA is on the ground inside Ukraine since 2014 up to and including to today. The SBU, when they carry out these drone strikes on targets deep inside Russia, or they're killing Russian generals in the streets of Moscow, or murdering journalists, non-combatants, and just outright terrorism, that is the US CIA overseeing and directing all of that. That is according to the New York Times. And so this story from the Financial Times, this should not be news to you. This is what the US has been doing all along since 2014 in terms of the intelligence agencies. And then, of course, since 2022, US generals have been running Ukraine's armed forces directly, well, at the very top of the chain of command. This is the New York Times. The partnership, the secret history of the war in Ukraine. And if you look through here, you will see them talking about targets, picking targets. Here they talk about the Wiesbaden. This is the location of the US military command structure in Germany. And they have American generals reviewing all of the Ukrainian targets on the lists and directing them with US weapons on how to strike them and giving them the intel and the targeting data to do so. At one point, they talk about an American general devising Operation Rolling Thunder, an artillery campaign against Russian targets. And it was US generals telling Ukraine which targets they were picking the targets. So US generals are overseeing the overall strategy, and they are even either approving of or selecting individual targets on the battlefield. And so when I say this is a US proxy war being waged against Russia simply through Ukraine, that is exactly what I mean. The US is waging a war against Russia, and they're simply laundering it through Ukrainians. So again, the CIA is running Ukrainian intelligence, which is carrying out these drone strikes. All of these drone strikes all along, including this most recent concerted campaign targeting Russian oil production. This was always the US carrying this out and simply doing it through Ukraine. So it's very important to understand that, and to understand this Financial Times article as not some revelation. This is just confirmation of what we should all already know by just paying attention to what the West itself has been admitting about the true nature of this conflict all along. Now, for people who are skeptical about whether or not President Trump would be overseeing strikes on targets deep inside Russia to cripple its economy, essentially, and then organize a fake peace negotiation with President Putin in Alaska, if you think the US wouldn't, and President Trump specifically would not do that, just remember what he was caught doing during his first administration. He had US Navy SEALs in North Korea murdering North Korean civilians, fishermen, so they could spy on the North Korean leadership ahead of fake peace talks President Trump proposed to North Korea then. And so this is, and not just to pick on President Trump, this is what the US does all the time. This is how they really do business. They're not negotiating in good faith. They hide behind negotiations to make it appear as if they're the ones trying to pursue a diplomatic path, and it's their adversaries who are leaving them no choice but to escalate. And President Trump is just the most recent US president to use this formula, and he's using it vis-a-vis Russia right now. And again, this was all obvious before the election even took place. This is Newsweek, October 2024. J.D. Vance tells Tim Dillon, U.S. needs weapons to fight China, not Russia. People were talking about President Trump ending all the endless wars, but they were telling you up front, if we end the conflict in Ukraine, and if you read the details, they weren't even talking about ending it. They were talking about freezing it. It's only so that we can fight a much larger and more dangerous war against China. There is no desire for peace. They are pursuing primacy, and they are simply conducting a campaign of division of labor and strategic sequencing, which is in the policy papers connected directly to this administration itself. And then, so you read this at face value, it says right here, the Ohio senator has advocated a negotiated settlement in the Ukraine conflict, which the Harris campaign previously described to Newsweek as a surrender plan for Kiev. And that all sounds like the Trump administration really wanted to end the conflict in Ukraine. But if you clicked on that, it would bring you to this article. J.D. Vance floats Donald Trump deal to end war in Ukraine. And if you actually read it, he's talking about freezing the conflict, Minsk 3.0. Potential peace talks with Trump could involve a heavily fortified demilitarized zone at the country's borders. You're just freezing it. You're not getting to the root of the conflict and ending it or resolving it. You are simply freezing it. That was always the plan, to freeze it and pivot toward China and then circle back around, just like the US did with Minsk 1 and 2, circle back around and restart hostilities once the Ukrainians are rebuilt for a third, fourth, fifth time. There's this void that is being created by Ukraine's collapsing fighting capacity. The US needs Europe to fill that void. That is what they're basically doing. And at the same time, they need to pivot toward China and replicate this entire process with China. In many ways, they already are. I've warned about this. Also, that everything that they were doing to Russia from 2014 onward, they would eventually start doing to China. And we saw a little bit of that with the US blanket banning Huawei from selling its products across the entire West, essentially. Literally detaining a senior Huawei corporate officer in Canada. Sanctions, tariffs, politically capturing nations like the Philippines or even territory like Chinese territory, like the island province of Taiwan, and transforming them into a battering ram to use against China. All of these things the US did to Russia in the lead up to this war in Ukraine right now. And the logical conclusion is, yes, there will be a proxy war, maybe a direct war with China. There will also be the seizure of Chinese assets. We already see the US trying to strip away in a certain way Chinese companies, or at least their overseas subsidiaries. TikTok, for example, in the United States. And then there was just this. Out of Politico, Dutch government seizes controlled Chinese-owned chip maker Nexperia. The move could inflame wider trade tensions between Beijing and the European Union. Imagine if China did this to a European company located in China, what the reaction would be to that. And they're talking about how it has granted itself the power to intervene in the company's decisions. At the Dutch-based Chinese-owned chip maker Nexperia, the highly unusual step, announced late Sunday, grants the country and the Dutch government, essentially, this was earlier today, this article. They could halt and reverse company decisions, meaning Nexperia cannot transfer assets or hire executives without Dutch government approval, according to national media. The move is a significant escalation in relations between the Netherlands and China and could inflame wider trade tensions between Beijing and the European Union, with Europe caught in the middle of a tit-for-tat chips war between the US and China. And we just watched President Trump put 100% more tariffs on China, acting as if China's export controls over rare earth minerals, which will be used in weapons, the US is already pointing at China, acting as if China just did this out of the blue, as if the United States, all of these things that I just talked about, targeting Huawei, trying to dismantle Huawei, arresting a senior corporate officer from Huawei, trying to strangle its access to chips and chip manufacturing technology, as if the US hadn't already been doing all of this for years, and China is just reacting to it. And now they've essentially seized control of this Chinese company based in the Netherlands. If you place assets in the West and you don't do exactly what they tell you, if you do not subordinate yourself absolutely to everything they say, it may seem reasonable now, but a year or two from now, it may become extremely unreasonable, even counter your own self-preservation. If you say no to them, they will just take it from you. That is what they're telling the entire world. If you do business with us and you do not do what we tell you to do, we will just take everything you have from you. Anything you're foolish enough to place under our control, our potential control in the West, we will take from you. I've done it to Russia, and now they are doing it to China. And this is just the first step. They will continue doing this on a larger, more aggressive scale vis-a-vis China and anyone else who opposes the West and does not subordinate themselves to it. As I've pointed out many times, US foreign policy prioritizes the pursuit of American hegemony over the entire planet. They have been doing this since the end of the Cold War. Everything serves that purpose. And all of this is in the policy papers. For years and years and years, they've been one policy paper after the other, telling you exactly what they're going to do and then doing it step by step as described in these papers. I've been covering this for years. I will continue covering it. I want to show you this policy paper that I will be covering in greater detail in upcoming articles and videos. Very important. The U.S. Naval War College Review, a maritime oil blockade against China. Tactically tempting, but strategically flawed. People will read this from 2018 and they will say, Brian, they thought about it and they realized it's strategically flawed. So why are you still talking about it? It's all the way back from 2018. How could a paper from 2018 still be relevant today? If you actually read the paper, it is talking about all of the challenges, the obstacles to implementing a blockade back in 2018. If you look at what the United States has done since 2018, they have been specifically addressing each and every one of these obstacles to remove them so that the US can impose a blockade on China, a maritime blockade on China. The largest obstacle was, back then, the collective West's integration with China economically. Now we are watching in real time with steps exactly like this. And with the tariffs regimen. Decoupling, hard decoupling. The US is going to do this at any cost to insulate themselves from when they do start a war with China or implement a blockade against China, targeting and trying to destroy the Chinese economy. It doesn't take the West with it. That is what they are doing right now. They are shaping the battlefield for that. If you look at this policy paper, they're talking about a distant blockade. They're not talking about fighting China right off its own coasts. They're talking about fighting China right beyond the range of the majority of their weapon systems. And they're talking about the Strait of Malacca. They're talking about this is why they're interested in the South China Sea. This is why China's been fortifying the South China Sea. They're talking about doing this off the coast of the Philippines, Taiwan, and of course, Japan. Something else that they talk about is the Belt and Road Initiative. They said China knows we're doing this. We've been planning this for years and years. They've been working on the Belt and Road Initiative to try to circumvent any sort of maritime blockade, because people will often bring that up. So it says a distant blockade also would need to interdict the Myanmar-China oil pipeline. I've talked about this many times. Here's an article that I'm going to get to in just a minute. Here's a map of it. So it starts here in the Bay of Bengal, goes across Myanmar to China, Kunming, China. And this allows China to send hydrocarbons directly to China through Myanmar without going through these straits that the US openly plans on blockading right here. So the pipeline is here, it goes through here, instead of going through here where the US is setting up these choke points. Preventing tankers from offloading at the terminal in Myanmar would require few, if any, naval platforms to remain on site. The area could be declared an exclusion zone for the duration of a conflict, and if the Myanmar authorities fail to comply, the facility could be disabled via airstrikes, aerial mining, or other kinetic actions. In short, US forces likely would be able to neutralize rapidly China's overland routes for seaborne oil imports to avoid the Strait of Malacca and other choke points further east and prevent them from diverting forces needed to seal other maritime ingress routes. In other words, we know the Belt and Road Initiative exists. We'll just simply bomb it because, again, it's beyond the range of Chinese military capabilities. We're not going to fight China directly. We will lose. We will use our global spanning military, our ability to move around the globe militarily in ways China and Russia cannot. We will use that to our advantage, and we will hit them everywhere else to cut off their ability to export and their necessity to import raw materials and especially energy. Now, that was 2018. They talked about bombing the pipeline in Myanmar. Since then, and again, this is how you know, people ask me, how do you know which policy papers are actually describing policy the US is implementing versus just a random policy paper someone just wrote as busy work? Because of things like this article from the Irrawaddy, which is a National Endowment for Democracy funded propaganda outlet in Myanmar, China-backed pipeline facility damaged in Myanmar resistance attack. This was 2022. This is just one of many. This is what the article says. An offtake station in the China-backed oil and gas pipeline was damaged when a local resistance group, and they're talking about US-backed and armed terrorists in Myanmar, fighting against the central government, trying to overthrow the government so they can install a client regime and then just dismantle the Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure. So that was near Mandalay. Anti-Chinese sentiment swelled in Myanmar following the military coup last February, so again, 2022, with many people believing Beijing had a hand in the takeover. At that time, there were calls for a boycott of Chinese products, along with calls to blow up the pipelines if China refused to condemn the regime. And we remember there was a similar pipeline Russia was building to connect its energy supply to Germany and the rest of Europe. Someone blew that one up too. And this is the point. They're not necessarily going to do all of this directly with their military. They have this ability through the National Endowment for Democracy to reach into all of these other countries. They cannot reach into China and Russia. They can reach into all of these other countries. They can build up opposition that will terrorize a sitting government and target infrastructure. They will also overthrow that sitting government that is friendly with China. They will overthrow it. They will install into power a client regime, much like the one in Ukraine, that will transform the country into a battering ram and then suicidally use it against China at the cost of their own self-preservation. So this is the game plan. This is where we are. It's not just the US proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. It is a global campaign the US is pursuing to maintain primacy, to prevent the rise of multipolarism, is not being fought just against Russia, China, and say nations like Iran. It's also being fought against all of these other nations in between that the US could potentially absorb and use as a proxy, as an extension of its own geopolitical power, or nations that could integrate themselves with the emerging multipolar world order and isolate the US and its unipolar pursuit and ultimately neutralize it. And so this is what we are watching a battle for. So this is the game plan. This is what they told us they were going to do. This is what the Biden administration was in the middle of doing. This is what President Trump, before he even won the election in 2024, this is what his vice president nominee, J.D. Vance, this is what they said they were going to do. They were going to try to freeze the conflict in Ukraine and pivot toward an even larger, more dangerous conflict in China. In February, Secretary Hegseth talked about Europe filling the void that Ukraine's collapsing fighting capacity was creating in hopes of freezing the conflict. And in order to get Russia to agree to a freeze so the US can pivot toward China and then circle back around later, continue the Minsk cycle yet again, they are using a combination of strikes on Russian energy production, threatening the shipment of Russian energy by sea, and continuing to prepare European troops to serve as a tripwire or a human shield going into Ukraine itself to cement the freeze, to prevent Russia from restarting the special military operation once they realize that, yes, this is Minsk 3.0. But Russia has not agreed to any of this, and this is why the US continues to escalate, just like it did under the Biden administration. And all of this is taking place as the US is openly pivoting toward China and preparing to do the exact same thing, only on a much larger, more dangerous scale. And so we need to keep a very close eye on all of this. We need to zoom out and look at this as a whole. Let's not myopically focus too much on any one conflict. Let's see how they all connect together. And as always, read the policy papers. They are telling you what they are going to do, and then they are doing it. And they use political theater to distract you away from that, to try to convince you something else is happening. Unfortunately, it works all too well for most people. My job and the job of others out there doing this type of analysis is to try to help you see through that theater, look past that distraction, and see the continuity of agenda as it unfolds. Maybe in some way we can get ahead of it and even stop it. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for all the other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos go up on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Telegram. In the video description below will be all of the links that I referenced in this video. Also in the video description are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. Again, the links will be in the video description below. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare, you're just helping share my work, sending news tips, just a kind comment in the comment section below the video. All of that greatly helps. All of that contributes to making this work possible. So I thank you sincerely, and as always, thank you for watching.